Bible talks about peace, and when it does, it always points us to a person. In fact, hundreds of years before that person came, he was known as the Prince of Peace, which is a wonderful title when you think about it. It's a wonderful title because it means he has the absolute authority to deliver peace. And he made it his mission to do exactly that, to bring, first of all, peace with God. Because once we have peace with God, actually the world can crumble all around us and we know we are safe. In a little while, Eddie is going to speak to us on this subject of experiencing God and experiencing peace. He's actually got a very big passage to look at with many different stories weaved through that. But I want to read one of those stories now because it's an illustration of God in the shape of Christ bringing peace. So we're looking at Mark chapter 4, verse 35. Say that again. Mark chapter 4, verse 35. And in my Bible, that's labeled, Jesus calms the storm. So as soon as we read this, the children will slip out, we'll sing another song, and we'll hand over to Eddie. But let's read this together now. When I say together, I'll read. You read along silently with me. But take in these words, because they're great words. Jesus calms the storm. Verse 35. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, he took them along, just as he was, in the boat. There was also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Amen. Amen.
It's a great pleasure and an honour until you get sent the reading. And then you go, wow. So we've got a big task on our hands this morning. We got 3 readings, of which Martin read the first one for us, on the subject of knowing God and knowing peace, or experiencing God and experiencing peace. Basically, what we see in these stories, when we look at it from the viewpoint of peace, is that we have a situation that is not peaceful, and then we have Jesus, and then we have a situation that is peaceful. However, in some of the stories we're going to read, there is also the opposite of that happening. And I think it's important to point that out so that we know what good looks like. Because if you don't know what bad is, you won't know really, truly what good is. And God's peace is so enormous that we really need to get a full picture of it. And so we're going to look at these 3 passages. Martin read the first one for us, so we won't go through that again. And we won't read it all out. But what we've got is the story of Jesus calming the storm. And this is a very clear story, isn't it? It's a very clear story of something that is not peaceful, Jesus, and then something that is peaceful. However, that is not all the story. And you're missing out on something if that is all you think about when you see this title at the beginning of these few verses that say, Jesus calms the storm. So what do we find? Well, let's start at the beginning, verse 35. That day when evening came, Jesus had already been on now let me get this right, the west side of the Sea of Galilee. A bit of a geography lesson. I'm going to try and do this the wrong way round so that you can see. Here is the Mediterranean Sea. Imagine it in your heads. Here is what we know as now modern-day Israel. And then there's a line down the page, which is the River Jordan. And at the top, we have the Sea of Galilee. And at the bottom, we have the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea. And Jesus is at the top, in between the Mediterranean and the Sea of Galilee. And he's on this side, the west. And basically, he's going to move over to the other side, which is the east. I hope that makes sense. And what he says is, let's go over to the side. But it's at the end of the day. He's had a busy day. He's been stood on a boat, which is not easy physically, preaching to crowds of people. He's had a full day. And now he says to the disciples, let's go over to the other side. Let's get in a boat at the end of a long day and sail over to the other side of this lake. Now, this lake is a little bit notorious. This lake is within 2 square miles of the size of Birmingham, which also is quite notorious. But it's about that size, It's about that size, and because of its size and where it was, and the weather in that area, the lake was known to cause trouble. Very, very quickly, storms would come, and waves would come, and it would be difficult and treacherous. And these people would have known that, because a lot of them were fishermen. And they would have spent time on this lake, and they would have known of its the possibility of things becoming a little bit difficult. So Jesus said, it's the end of a day, let's go over to the other side. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was. Now, I don't know about you, but that sends a few shivers down my spine. When I go on holiday, I have an Excel spreadsheet. And I have a list of things that I need to take with me and where we're going to go on every day of the week. It doesn't always work, of course. It's more of a plan than a schedule. But everything is planned out. Jesus gets in the boat just as he was. He's been there all day preaching. There's no pack up. There is no nipping home for an overnight bag. They're just going to go over a lake that is a little bit notorious. And what do we see the disciples doing? There were also other boats with him that were going with him. The disciples got into the boat and said, let's take him across. Let's go across to the side. The disciples here are showing a great deal of trust and obedience to what Jesus is saying. And it's Jesus saying it. So what we need to remember to make this story most impactful is Jesus says, the creator of the universe, let us go over to the other side. So what do you think is going to happen? Well, they're going to go over to the other side. So bear that in mind as we go through the rest of the story. We go into the other side, said Jesus. They get into the boat and they start to go to the other side. And what happens? Well, the story's here in front of us. It was always going to happen. A furious squall, which is a fantastic word, starts. There's a storm. And the storm is so ferocious that the waves are coming up and they're breaking over the boat, over the top of the boat. Obviously, the best thing for a boat is to have water on the outside and not on the inside. Water is coming on the inside, and quite realistically, which if you were in this situation, you would find it the same. The disciples were frightened. They were fearful, and we know that because Jesus points it out for us later. They were fearful. And this fear came from within. So this first story that we're looking at of Jesus and God's peace is focusing on these guys' psychological problems. There is the storm, but there is also the words of Jesus that say we're going to the other side. And they see the storm and they don't remember the words. But what do? The storm comes. And they run to Jesus, who happens to be asleep. That's how calm he is. He's asleep in the boat. He's had a long day. He's tired. But he's asleep in the boat, and they go to Jesus, and they call out to him. And that is the best thing to do, isn't it? The best thing to do when problems come our way, particularly psychological problems, is to cry out to God, to go and talk to Jesus. So it was interesting to find that as I read through this, a lot of people describe these conversations as prayers. And I found that a little bit, it was a bit awkward. It didn't quite, they're having a conversation with Jesus. But they called it prayers. And what do we do? When we go and talk to God about the problems we've got, what are we doing? Well, we're praying, aren't we? And in the same way, it's just that Jesus was in a different place, sort of. He was in the boat and they were having a real physical conversation with him. And we're not with Jesus physically, but we can talk to Jesus, we can talk to God, and when we do, that's called praying. And so what the disciples were doing here was praying. They went to God, and they asked Jesus Christ, the Son of God, to help them. Their attitude is a little bit askew, isn't it? Firstly, they're scared of the storm and forget what Jesus has said. But they also say, don't you care? As if Jesus would possibly not care about them. And so their minds are a little bit, they haven't quite got the picture. This is Jesus, he's with you. And he said, we're going to the other side. And now you're accusing him of not caring for you and fearful of drowning in this terrible storm. What does Jesus get up and do? Jesus gets up and talks to the weather. And he says, be quiet. And the weather does exactly what Jesus tells it to do. And this is amazing. And that's our story. There's a storm and then Jesus gets up and he says a few words and the storm goes away. But unfortunately, it's not quite the end of the story. Now, at this point, I must point out that the disciples, in connection with the storm, we can quite safely say the disciples are no longer fearful of the storm. The storm has gone. So, in a way, peace has come into the lives of the disciples because they're no longer afraid of the storm. But what do we read? Verse 41 of Mark chapter 4. They were terrified. And you say, Eddie, you're up there talking to us about peace. The disciples have gone to DEFCON 3 to DEFCON 5 in an instant. They were frightened of the storm, fearful of the storm, because Jesus asked them these questions. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? But actually now they're terrified. And what are they terrified of? Another word, as well as prayer, another word I found as I was reading through stuff to study for this, was superstition. And superstition is really illogical behaviour based on some belief system that is erroneous, it's wrong. And people do all sorts of things, throwing salt over your shoulder when you've spilt some, not walking under a ladder. I mean, I think that's quite sensible because there's usually somebody up a ladder, usually holding some paint, and therefore walking around would be a sensible idea. But a lot of superstitions are completely out of kilter. And Jesus says to them, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Because they're now terrified because they've seen something happen that shouldn't happen. Here is a man who's just woken up, talked to the weather and calmed it down. That shouldn't happen. And this is, in a sense, a superstition because we know they're with Jesus Christ. And we know Jesus Christ has the power to do that, but the disciples still don't get it. There are degrees of belief, and they're happy enough to get into a boat with him, ill-prepared, to sail across a lake that they know is troublesome. But as soon as a bit of a storm comes along, they've got a problem. And now they've got a bigger problem because what they've seen Jesus do to the storm has left them a little bit, well, not a little bit, a lot, terrified. They've moved from afraid to terrified. And we say, where's the peace here? Well, the peace that we see here it's a clue. And if you look in verse 41, the disciples speak to each other. And what are the first three words they use? Who is this? It's a great question to ask. You imagine your neighbour, your family member, your friend, your colleague coming to you and asking that question. They're not a Christian. They come to you and they say, who is this? That is a fantastic opportunity, isn't it? Who is Jesus Christ? And you can start and you can tell them, and there's the gospel straight away. Who is this? The fear of the Lord leads to wisdom, the Bible tells us. And here they are, terrified not of the storm, but of Jesus and his power. And rather than doing the wrong thing, they do the right thing. Their terror leads them to ask a question, who is this? We want to know more about Jesus. We want to know more about God. And the knowledge of God, the fear of God, is the beginning of wisdom. When we read the Bible, Proverbs particularly, parts of James, we see also that knowledge of God, knowledge of his truth, knowledge of him, knowledge of who he is, what he can do, brings peace. There's a very close relationship between knowing God and knowing peace. And we've got the title Experiencing. But experiencing God is about getting to know him, spending time with him, reading the Bible that he wrote for us, getting to know all about him. And as we know more and we realize what God is, where the greater and greater peace comes into our lives. Now, here, okay, we've seen the storm and we've seen Jesus and we've seen peace. We look at the disciples and we go from fear, Jesus, terror. Okay, and it doesn't quite fit the picture, but what we're seeing here is the beginning of peace in their lives. This is very early on in the Bible. In chapter 3 of Mark 4 is where we find Jesus picking the 12 disciples. This is really early days. And Jesus can calm a storm in seconds, but his work within us takes a long time, as you, I think, if you're honest with yourself, will realise. And me too. I have been a Christian for 44 years. God is still having to knock the corners off. And it's the same with you too. God will take a whole lifetime growing slowly within you the peace that comes from knowing him. Knowing him takes time. The peace that comes from that takes time. Let me encourage you to use your time wisely in getting to know God. Because as you get to know God more, you will know his peace more. And this, for the disciples, they're just starting out on that journey. So here is Jesus demonstrating, yes, his power over the storm, but more so the work that he's doing to bring peace into the lives of people who are psychologically in turmoil. They have fear. Fear of the storm, terror of what Jesus has done with the storm. So that's psychological issues. Let's move on to our next story. And I'll read it to you. It says, Jesus, and the heading, Jesus restores a demon-possessed man. Let's read the passage. It's from chapter 5, and verse 1. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained, hand and foot, and he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside. And the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him go, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. Here is a story, this time not of psychological problems, but of spiritual problems, deep, serious spiritual problems. As we look at this story, we see the demon-possessed man and we go, where's the use in looking at this passage, because we don't know any demon-possessed people. The problem is that a demon-possessed people, however tragic and difficult that is to deal with, is no worse off than anyone else who doesn't know Jesus Christ. Because anyone who doesn't know Jesus Christ, however much they don't know Jesus Christ, however far away, they're still separated from God because of their sin. When we read this story, we're quite amazed to see that this man, who surely represents everything that is evil, possessed by many demons, actually comes running to Jesus when he gets there. When he saw Jesus from a distance, it says in verse 6, he ran and fell on his knees. Knees crop up quite a lot in these passages. Fell on his knees in front of him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me?" Well, what had happened before he shouted that, we read a bit later on. Jesus has said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." But what he does is he kneels in front of Jesus and asks Jesus not to torture him. What the spirits think is that Jesus is going to send them somewhere where they can do no longer any mischief. And that is what their job is. That is what they want to do more than anything else, is to disturb the peace. And they want to do that, and so they ask Jesus not to send them somewhere where they can't do that anymore. And they find the pigs. And they say, well, send us to the pigs instead. We'll go to the pigs. But as they're there pleading and talking and trying to get Jesus to do what they want, they use a trick. It's a very good trick, and it works. It works for my mum, anyway. And that trick is to use my full name, Edward James Neat. And when my mum says that, I know that I'm in trouble. There is something that is not as it should be, and she wants to control that situation to bring everything back to the status quo that she desires. Of course, actually, that's permission for me to misbehave more, because it's my mum, and I like winding her up. But she says Edward James Neat, because she wants to gain control of the situation. We see here that as the man runs to Jesus, and clearly it's the demons talking, they say to him, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Not even the disciples were at the point where they could say that with any conviction. Because way, way later on, just before, in fact, the end of Jesus' ministry on earth, Jesus asks the disciples, "Who am I?" And when Peter says, "You are the Christ," Jesus sort of says, "Well done, but you didn't get that on your own. God told you." So even right at the end of Jesus' ministry, the disciples are still struggling with who Jesus is. They've started the journey. They start the journey here. Who is he? But that process of getting to know God is a long and a slow one. But of course, this man has got an advantage, so to speak. The demons know who Jesus is. And they come to him and they use his full name to try and manipulate the situation, but he's having none of it, and he answers their plea to him to send them into the pigs. And so he does. And the pigs run down the hill into the water and are drowned. I don't know what happens to the evil spirits at that point. The Bible doesn't tell us. It's not important. So we need to refocus, as great as that imagery is, we need to focus back on Jesus and this man who was demon-possessed and now isn't. And he's sitting there, it says, dressed and in his right mind, and the people from the local area come to see what's happened. They get told and they come to Jesus. Now, just like our first story with the storm, we've got a demon-possessed man, we've got Jesus, and we've got peace. A man who is dressed and in his right mind and looking normal. On the other hand, we've got some people who are quite distressed at losing their pigs. They come to Jesus, and yet a bit like the disciples moving from fear to terror in the first story, we've got these people who don't find what has happened very peaceful at all. In fact, it says they were afraid. And they asked Jesus to leave. And why is that? Because sometimes when Jesus gets involved in a situation, people don't like it. If I introduce Jesus into a conversation at work, it has one of two effects. Conversation ends quite quickly, or people get a bit upset. Now, I work in a fantastic situation, the most non-PC factory in the world, and people are quite at liberty to come and poke fun, tease me, have a go about Christianity, which is great because that's a license for me to respond to that in a way that I quite enjoy. But people don't like being exposed to Jesus. They don't like being shown the Word of God. They don't like thinking about the holiness of God and what he expects of us and what Jesus taught us, because it shows them up for what they are and they don't like it. It's very uncomfortable, and these people were uncomfortable. They didn't want Jesus there. This was not like the man who had been released from these demons. This is about people who were going, this is not good. And this again is superstition. A human being, as they were looking at him, Jesus Christ, should not have the power to be able to release this man from demons. We've tried everything we can to control this man, and he is uncontrollable. And this guy turns up and says a few words to him, and boom, they've gone, just like the storm. Gone. Peace reigns. But unfortunately for those people, they don't like that peace. They probably didn't like losing their pigs either, but they were frightened. They were afraid of the power that was here. I'd heard a sermon a couple of weeks ago at our church about us reading the Bible, and the Bible tells us when we read the Bible we should tremble, because this is God's word to us, and it is powerful, and it is meaningful, and we should not ignore it. In fact, we should desire to get to know it so well that it rules everything. David said, didn't he, your word I've hid in my heart that I shouldn't sin against you. And that's how powerful it is. And when it comes to us, sometimes we're the same as the people that lived in this area. And we go, whoa, wait a minute, that's a bit much. That is a corner of my life that I don't want to give up to Jesus. That is a corner of my life I don't want the light of the Bible to shine upon, because I want to keep it secret. I don't want God to talk to me through his word about that, because it's uncomfortable for me. And we can sometimes be guilty, like these people, of repelling. Of course, we know that the fear of God brings about, through the knowledge that we get from the fear of God, the peace of God. And so if we act like that, and we find ourselves acting like that, we know that we're stopping that channel from working properly. We're not going to get to peace because we've stopped the whole thing. We don't fear God enough to read his word and apply it to our lives and do what we should do. And as a result, we don't know him as well as we should, and therefore we don't get the peace that we should. So there we see the power of Jesus, the power of God over the spiritual world. And the last one, and we've got 5 minutes. We'll read it quickly. Jesus raises a dead girl and heals a sick woman. I've actually squeezed 2 stories into here. But I'm just going to carry on and hope I get away with it. Verse 21. Jesus raises a dead girl and heals a sick woman. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," the disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. If we first saw the psychological problems that Jesus dealt with, and then secondly we saw the spiritual, here is the physical. This is much more the things that we face on a day-to-day basis, the struggles that we have, simply because we're alive and human, and we have all sorts of ailments. And when we have those ailments, we feel sorry, don't we, for ourselves. And Jesus here, as he's listening to Jairus, as he comes up to tell him about his daughter, he feels for Jairus. And he says to Jairus, and goes with him immediately. He doesn't question him, he just leaves. And clearly his intention is to go to the house. Here we have an acute problem. Here is a little girl, we find out later in the passage, is 12 years old. She has been, as far as we can see, perfectly well, and then suddenly she gets sick. And this sickness is to death. Okay, this sickness is going to kill her. Jairus is aware of that, whatever it was the problem was. She's got an acute problem. And Jesus shows his love for this man by going with him. And he sets off and starts on that journey. But he gets interrupted. Don't know what Jairus thought at this point. The clock's ticking. But he gets stopped. And he stops because this woman has come to him, unbeknownst to him, and decided that she too has a problem. Her problem is a chronic problem. Her problem has been with her for 12 years. And she's bleeding uncontrollably, and she's been to doctors, and they've tried to sort her out, but it's not. And it says she'd suffered much. She'd gone through a lot to try and sort out this problem, but nobody could do anything for her. Just like the demon-possessed man, nobody could do anything. But Jesus could. And so she comes to him and she says to herself, if I just touch his clothes, I can be healed. That is fantastic faith. That is a faith that is way stronger than mine, and I think, if you're honest with yourself, way stronger than yours. But getting close to Jesus is the answer to our problems. And she comes close and she touches the hem of his garment. Power leaves him, and he said, "Who touched me?" And the disciples, in disbelief, say, "You're in a massive crowd of people. Everyone's pressing around you. How can you say?" But Jesus knew what had gone on. And he stops proceeding to Jairus' house, and he looks round. And this woman, who clearly is struck with guilt, comes forward, and she falls at his feet, again in this same position that the demon-possessed man comes to Jesus with. Knowing who he is and respecting him, but unlike the demon-possessed man who said, "I want nothing to do with you," she wants everything to do with him. But she's fearful. Again, here's the power of Jesus at work, and what effect does it have on this woman? She is fearful. But Jesus reassures her in verses 30 and 31. He looks at 33. The woman, knowing what had happened, came to her and he fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the truth. In verse 34, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Christ reassures her. She is troubled. She was troubled by her problem. Now she's troubled by the power that she has just witnessed. And perhaps a little bit guilt-ridden because she's gone about it in a slightly dubious way. I would suggest that if that is your worry, that you stop worrying about it. The thing is that if you've got a problem, you come to Jesus. And we're all different, and we all approach God in different ways, and we all pray to him differently, but just keep doing it. Pray to Jesus. Do whatever it needs for you to get in touch with God, to know him, to ask him to answer the promises he's made in his word, get to know his word, get to know him, and come to him however you need to ask him for the things that you need. This woman didn't stop. It put her through some trouble, but Jesus reassures her and sends her away in peace. She had a big problem, and now she's peaceful. And Jesus showed his power over the physical. And then he carries on. He carries on to go to Jairus' house. And what do we find there? Here's Jairus. They've been told while they were out in the crowd that the girl has died. She's gone. We see again superstition. These people come from the house to Jairus as he stood there near Jesus, and they say, "Don't bother the teacher anymore. She's gone." They don't think that Jesus can do anything about that situation. When she was poorly, perhaps they had a little bit of hope. But now she's gone, that's it. Jesus can do nothing about this problem. This problem is too big. My beliefs, my superstitions tell me that Jesus Christ is not that good. He can't do anything. But Jesus hears that, and he turns round and he reassures Jairus. And he says to him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." And then he takes 3 disciples with him and goes to the house. And here we're confronted with more people with superstition. There is no way that anyone can do anything about this situation. It is done. It is finished. It's final. She has died. She's gone. That's it. And he gets to the house, and what he says to them, "This child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laugh at him. Here's another reaction of people that will never experience the peace that Jesus can bring. And they're not repelling him and asking him to go away, but they're mocking him, scorning him, because he's said something that they don't like. Their superstition is telling them that is not what is right. That is not what's going to happen. They laugh because this girl is dead, and surely, in their minds, nothing can do anything about that. But Jesus sends them out, and he takes the father and mother and the 3 disciples with him, and he goes and he talks to the child, and he says to her, the Talitha Kum, which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And just like he'd said to the storm, "Be still," he says to the girl, "Get up." And she does. And it's immediate. And the people around are amazed, aren't they? Completely astonished, it says in verse 42. We don't read about fear here, but I'm quite sure that if we went and had a look at the Greek, that probably we'd find a little element of that in there. You know, they're shocked, certainly. They're astonished. They've gone, wow, this is something outside what we believe. God cannot calm storms. God cannot cast out demons. God cannot raise people from the dead. And all those things are completely done away with by the evidence right in front of them. We have a Bible that God has written for us so that we can see the power of Jesus. We have a Bible that's written for us so we can see the power of God. If I were to consider the universe and how big it is, and there's lots of description in the first part of the Bible about God's creation of the universe, but there's a few words that say, "And he flung stars into space." And if I started telling you about the stars, the numbers I would have to start using are just too big for our mortal minds to understand. And the one verse that says, "And God flung the stars into space." This is the God that we believe in. If we know Jesus Christ as our Saviour this morning, this is the God who has the power to deal with our problems. Now, I do need to point out at this point that ill health and death will come to us all. God is not the sort of God, and if, you know, there's the health and wealth, prosperity gospel that a lot of people like to push. Your life will be full of trouble. The Bible tells you that. Because you're a Christian, you'll have even more. Because you volunteered to get into the boat with Jesus. And so the storms are coming. Okay, that's your fault. But God has saved you. And when you think about what God is going to do for you, and not only your future glory in heaven, but what God is doing for you now, helping you to live life the way he wants you to, you'll realize that actually it's a pleasure to step into the boat, even when you know that the storms are coming, because Jesus is on your side. And we have this word that God has written to us to explain to us the power that he has and the fact that we're on his side, so that power is available to us. We won't get rid of every problem. We won't get rid of every illness. We're certainly not going to stop death coming at some point. However, we need to understand that while we're still here, while we're alive, the power of God is available to us. The Bible points this out and makes this very, very abundantly clear. God will give us abundantly, more than we can ask or think. All right? But there's some small print in that. For his will, for his purposes. We need to know the Bible, to know his will, to go about getting to know God, to know what he wants us to do, to go about that business, knowing with all confidence that God will give us everything we need to carry on going about his business. God is not going to give you what you think you want. God is not going to give you what you think you need. God is going to give you what he knows you need, and he knows better than you. So get to know the word, get to know the God of heaven, understand the power that is available to him, and then throw yourself at his feet. Get down on your knees and ask God to help you do the things that he's put you here to do. Great. Thank you.